All right, today we're going to talk about the Middle Ages, also known occasionally as medieval times. So, whenever you hear me say the medieval times, we're basically referring to the same time period. Also, in this unit, we're going to focus on Europe. However, the Middle Ages or medieval times for China or the Muslim world, as you're going to see, has a very different connotation because they are quite different from Europe at this time period. This is not the highlight of European history. In fact, this is the time period in history that Westerners or Europeans look at as being kind of the low point of Western civilization. And so go ahead and write the Middle Ages as your notes, and as your title for your notes, sorry. And let's go ahead and get started. Now, it doesn't have an exact date. It's one of those things where the dates are a bit arbitrary. A lot of people would say in Western Europe the Middle Ages start from somewhere around the collapse of Rome, which remember was 476, and last somewhere up until about the beginning of the Renaissance. And so, these dates are going to be different in many, many, many circumstances because you can't say exactly when it starts or when it finishes. But it's somewhere around 500 to 1300 CE or AD that this time period is going on in Europe. And the first part of it, especially like immediately after the collapse of Rome, when Europe is in political chaos and things are not doing well economically, politically, intellectually, this is known as the Dark Ages. And one of the reasons for that is just there's not enough people writing stuff down for us really to know as much about it. For example, we know more about what was going on in Rome because of the Roman scholars. But because society falls apart, there's no more scholars basically recording this time period of history. There's very few books, works of literature produced for this time period. An example is Beowulf in England is one of the very few like famous books or novels that we have from this era of history. And so because of this, it's known as the Dark Ages of European history. All right, so we talked about Rome and the Roman Empire. And now we're going to talk about basically, well, what happened after Rome, at least in the West, was gone. Remember, Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, lasted until 1456. And so the East was more politically stable during this time period and doing better. So again, I mean, the Middle Ages or medieval ages are really only bad in Western Europe. Although the Byzantine Empire, remember, is losing a sizable chunk of their kingdom during this time period as well to the new Islamic empires. But in Western Europe, it's pretty much political chaos. There are a few pseudo kingdoms that basically tried to retake as much territory as possible after the collapse of Rome. We talked about two of them already, the Visigoths in Spain and the Franks in what is modern day France. But eventually they as well fall apart. And eventually Europe is just hundreds of little kingdoms that are all basically ruled by a single ruler. And they're constantly fighting with each other to take more land from each other, to gain more power, to gain more resources. And as you'll see, this is called the feudal system. But it's not uncommon in history. This is what happens in China periodically when the Chinese government is overthrown. China breaks up into a bunch of smaller kingdoms. Japan, for much of its history, was broken up into a bunch of smaller kingdoms. In the Islamic world, after the Mongols, there will be a time period where the Islamic world is kind of fragmented into smaller kingdoms as well. Regular people basically during this time period don't have any type of glorious life. Like just imagine if you had lived in the city of Rome and somebody came and basically destroyed your home, sacked your empire, and basically destroyed the political stability in society. You would have no choice but to just move out to the countryside and try to like make a living for yourself and your family. And so like the regular people during this time period, it's really just survival of the fittest, right? It's produce as much food as you can possibly produce to feed you and your family. And then eventually, somebody's probably going to come and take over your land, and then you're going to be producing food not only for yourself, but you're going to have to be paying taxes in the form of food to the people that rule you. And so it's not a time period where much is going on other than agricultural production in order for basic survival. Very little is going on educationally. Very little is going on in terms of scientific or intellectual advancement during this time period. And so that's another reason why it's called the Dark Ages. The life expectancy, by the way, during this time period is around 30 years. And so people aren't living to be a long time, to be an old age. In fact, a lot of women die giving birth. A lot of babies don't make it to be the age of 2, which is, again, one of the reasons why the life expectancy during this time period, like in modern day worlds, the life expectancy is somewhere in the mid 70s. And it was less than half of that during the Middle Ages in European society. Cities basically fall apart. Think about it. Cities need a government in order to basically allow them to function. They need a government to organize the roads, the streets, the public baths, and all the other stuff that you need to have a city operate, especially a city like Rome that had 1 million people in it. You need somebody to organize that. But once the political aspect of society falls apart, so do the cities. And so cities are going to be way smaller in Europe than they are in other parts of the world, with the exception of Cordoba, which we mentioned during the Islamic Golden Age. So, for example, Cordoba has a population of about 400,000 or 500,000 people during the year 1000. Baghdad has 600,000 people. And Rome, which used to have 1 million people, is now down to just a little bit over 100,000 people. Remember, the Colosseum held 70,000 people, and the Circus Maximus held 120,000 people. So there's not even enough people living in what is Rome at that time period to fill these 2 stadiums up if they were still being used. And so it gives you an idea of just how small the cities were and how much things had fallen apart. Also, Paris and London, 50,000 to 100,000 people, not near what we would think of today as major European cities. They're more like big villages. I talked about survival. 30% of children died before they even reached the age of 2. There are various reasons for that, like disease, malnutrition, not being able to provide enough food for mom, therefore mom can't provide enough food for the child. And so it's very much just a time period of, if you can survive and make it to the age of 30 or something, you have a pretty good life. Food is scarce. As the Roman Empire falls apart, so does the plantation system that had basically fed Roman society. And society is broken up from like large efficient farms into tiny little farms. And so, other than the kings and nobles in society, not a lot of people are going to have meat in their diet. The 2 main sources of protein that the common peasant's going to have is milk and cheese from cows and goats, and also eggs from chickens. But you're not going to kill your animals very often that you need in society, because also the landlords are going to come, the feudal lords are going to come, and one of the ways they're going to tax you is by taking foods, and they're going to take probably the best animals and meat for themselves. And so the average person doesn't eat meat more than maybe once a month during this time period in history. They also destroy the aqueducts and all the other systems, and they're not rebuilt in cities. And so water is disgusting. The water out of the rivers, it's full of human sewage, it's full of animal sewage. And so they really start to drink ale, which is a type of beer, because it's safer, because the alcohol content in the drink actually helps to disinfect and kill some of the bacteria. And so this shows you again how like a basic commodity like clean running water in Roman society is a luxury of the past. It's something that most people don't have during this time period. And you're going to see in another journal entry that we're going to do that taking a bath was not common. Without running water, having to go to the river and collect your water and heat it up to take a bath, especially in the wintertime, people pretty much just take baths in the summertime when they can go and take a dip in the river, lake, or pond, because it's just too difficult to collect all the water and heat it up to take a bath any other time of year. And that pretty much summarizes a general introduction to the Middle Ages.